There is a certain stillness that comes when you spend enough time with very old texts. It is different from silence. Silence can feel empty. This feels full, as if something is present but choosing not to speak all at once. I notice it most late at night, when everything modern has finally gone quiet and the mind slows down enough to listen properly. That is usually when these stories begin to feel less like information and more like memory. I want to be clear from the beginning about what this is and what it is not. This is not a claim about hidden truths, it is not an argument, and it is not a prediction. Nothing here asks you to believe anything. What follows is a careful, patient reading of ancient sources and later traditions, treated as human attempts to preserve meaning, caution, and experience across time. In many cases, what survives is not certainty, but concern, and in my opinion, that concern is the most important part. When ancient people wrote about the distant past, they did not separate history, myth, and philosophy the way we do today. They used stories because stories could carry weight without precision. They could hold emotion, warning, and memory all at once. So when we encounter figures described as teachers, watchers, or divine beings, the first question should not be whether they were literally real, but why they were remembered that way. What problem were these stories trying to solve? What feeling were they trying to preserve? If this kind of slow, thoughtful history is something you enjoy, you are welcome here. I only ask for patience. And before we move any further, I want to pause for a moment in a very human way. If you are listening right now, wherever you are in the world, I would genuinely love to know where that is and what time it is there. I find something grounding in imagining these ancient questions drifting quietly through different time zones, reaching people who are awake when most of the world is not. The earliest civilizations we can study did not see themselves as standing at the beginning of time. That idea is a modern one. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, especially the Sumerians, understood themselves as inheritors. Their texts do not describe a proud ascent from ignorance to knowledge. They describe a world that had already changed before writing began. Again and again they refer to earlier ages, earlier orders, earlier arrangements that no longer existed in the same form. What always stands out to me is how cautious they sound. They did not say, "We discovered everything." They said, "This was established." They did not say, "We created order." They said, "Order was set in place." Even their kings were described as caretakers rather than originators. Authority flowed downward, not upward. That alone tells us something important about how they saw knowledge and power. In these texts, memory matters more than innovation. When later scribes wrote about the very beginning, they did not start with humans. They started with conditions, with waters not yet separated, with boundaries not yet fixed, with roles not yet assigned. This is not science, of course, but it is not nonsense either. It is a way of saying that before society could function, before cities could exist, something had to define limits. Someone, or something, had to teach those limits. This is where the earliest teacher figures appear. Not as rulers, not as tyrants, but as intermediaries between chaos and structure. In my view, that distinction is often lost in modern retellings. We tend to project our own fears backward, but the earliest layers of these stories are quieter than that. They're concerned with balance, with restraint, with what happens when boundaries are crossed too quickly. There is also something deeply human in the way these texts handle uncertainty. They do not pretend to know everything. They admit gaps. They repeat phrases like, "in those days," or "before the flood," not as precise timestamps, but as signals that the past being described lies beyond clear memory. It is a respectful distance, not an attempt to deceive. I often think about how different this is from the way we talk about progress today. We assume forward motion. We assume improvement. The ancient writers did not. They assumed cycles, rise, collapse, renewal. Knowledge could be gained, but it could also be lost, and once lost, it might return only in fragments. That worldview shapes everything that follows. When stories speak of beings who watched, the word itself is easy to misunderstand. Watching does not necessarily mean controlling. In many ancient languages, it carries the sense of observing carefully, of guarding, of bearing witness. A watcher is someone who remembers, someone who does not interfere unless necessary. That nuance matters because it changes how we hear the story. Rather than imagining distant overseers directing humanity, I find it more consistent with the text to imagine remembered figures who represented an earlier standard, a way of doing things correctly, a reminder of what knowledge looks like when it is handled with care. In my opinion, the anxiety in these stories comes not from fear of the watchers, but from fear of forgetting them. What happens when guidance is gone? What happens when rules are remembered, but the reasons behind them are lost? What happens when techniques survive, but the ethics that shaped them fade away? Those are not ancient questions, they are timeless ones. And this is why I think these texts survived at all. Not because they describe extraordinary beings, but because they capture a familiar human experience. The sense that we live downstream from something we no longer fully understand. The sense that wisdom once existed in a more complete form, and that we are left reconstructing it from pieces. I don't see arrogance in that. I see humility. As we move forward, we will encounter names, lists, and later interpretations that feel much more dramatic. But here at the beginning, the mood is subdued, almost mournful. These are not victory stories, they are preservation stories. In my own reading, that changes how I approach everything that comes next. It makes me less interested in proving anything, and more interested in listening. Less focused on answers, and more attentive to tone. And the tone, at least here, is careful. Something was known, something was taught, something was lost. And whatever it was, the people who remembered it wanted us to slow down before touching it. That is where this exploration begins. Chapter 2. When the Sumerians looked back toward their beginnings, they did not describe a heroic age of invention. They described an age of arrival. Cities did not emerge because humans suddenly became clever. They emerged because order was introduced. That distinction matters, because it tells us how these people understood themselves. Not as creators standing at the top of a story, but as participants stepping into something already in motion. The earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia sit in a landscape that is unforgiving in subtle ways. The land between the rivers can be fertile, but only if water is controlled. Too much, and everything is destroyed. Too little, and nothing grows. Survival there depends on balance, timing, and coordination. Irrigation is not just a technique. It is a discipline. It requires shared rules, shared calendars, shared labour, and shared restraint. What I find striking is how often ancient texts emphasize that these systems were taught, not discovered. Channels were laid out according to principles, fields were divided according to measures, calendars aligned human labour with seasonal and celestial rhythms. None of this is framed as trial and error. It is framed as instruction. This does not mean the Sumerians believed humans were passive. Far from it. They understood effort, discipline, and responsibility. But they did not believe wisdom began with them. They believed it was inherited. In my opinion, this is where many modern misunderstandings begin. When we read about early cities and see rapid development, we often rush to explain it in purely technical terms. Better tools, better organisation, better luck. Those explanations are valid, but incomplete. They miss the psychological dimension. They miss how ancient people felt about their own knowledge. To them, knowledge carried weight. It demanded respect, and it came with consequences. That is why the figures who appear in these stories are not inventors, but teachers. They do not rule cities. They shape practices. They establish boundaries. They define what should be done and what should not. The Apkallu belong to this category. They are described as sages from a time before kingship became fully human, before authority was localized, before the world settled into its familiar patterns. In some texts, they are associated with water, particularly the deep freshwater source beneath the earth. Water, in Sumerian thought, is not just physical. It is symbolic of potential, of depth, of origins. What matters here is not the imagery itself, but what it communicates. These teachers come from below or beyond, from a place humans do not normally access. They bring structure upward into the visible world. This is a recurring motif across ancient cultures, but in Sumer it is especially restrained. There is no triumph, there is no conquest. There is simply the act of setting things in place. Writing, for example, is not described as a clever human breakthrough. It is described as something given shape under guidance. The earliest writing systems are administrative. They track grain, labour, offerings, and land. They are tools of coordination, not expression. That tells us something important. Writing was not about creativity at first. It was about responsibility. Once something is written down, it can be checked. It can be remembered. It can be held against you. That alone suggests why ancient people might associate writing with teacher figures rather than inventors. Writing fixes things. It limits improvisation. It creates accountability. And accountability is one of the quiet themes running through these stories. When later texts list the domains taught by the Apkallu, they are practical. Agriculture, architecture, ritual timing, measurement, law. These are not abstract sciences. They are frameworks for living together without collapsing into chaos. From that perspective, the idea of watchers begins to make more sense. A watcher is not someone who interferes constantly. A watcher is someone who ensures that established boundaries are respected, someone who notices deviation, someone who remembers how things are supposed to work. In my view, this is less about surveillance and more about stewardship. It also explains why later traditions become uneasy with these figures, because once guidance is withdrawn, memory becomes dangerous. People remember the rules, but not the reasons. They repeat the forms, but lose the restraint that once accompanied them. This is where the stories start to change tone. Early Sumerian material treats the teacher figures with respect, but also with distance. They belong to another age. Their time has passed. They are not present rulers. They are remembered authorities. As kingship becomes more human-centered, the role of these figures diminishes. Authority shifts from instruction to enforcement, from teaching to ruling, and that transition is not portrayed as entirely positive. Some texts suggest that when humans attempt to act without guidance, imbalance follows. Excess, noise, overreach. These are moral categories, not technical ones. They describe societies that have forgotten limits. In later retellings, this tension hardens into conflict. Teacher figures become rebels. Watchers become transgressors. What was once careful instruction becomes forbidden knowledge. But here, in the earlier layer, the mood is quieter. What always stays with me is how these texts treat loss. They do not dramatize it. They accept it. The flood, when it appears, is not punishment in the modern sense. It is a reset, a recognition that something has gone too far, too fast. And even then, not everything is destroyed. Knowledge is preserved selectively. Memory survives in fragments. Certain principles remain, others are withdrawn. This selective preservation is one of the most human aspects of these stories. We do the same thing today. We choose what to pass on, what to archive, what to forget, what to warn against. When ancient scribes wrote about knowledge being sealed, hidden, or restricted, I don't hear conspiracy. I hear caution. I hear people recognizing that some things, once released without context, can do harm. That idea alone makes these texts feel unexpectedly modern. In my opinion, the most important takeaway from this stage of the story is not who the teachers were, but why they mattered. They represented a standard, a memory of balance, a reminder that civilization is not just built from tools, but from restraint. As we move forward, later cultures will reinterpret these figures. They will project new fears onto them, new moral frameworks, new conflicts. But beneath all of that, there remains a quiet core, the sense that long before monuments and empires, there was an effort to teach humanity how to live within limits, and that when those limits were forgotten, the stories became warnings instead of lessons. That shift is subtle, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and it prepares us for the next stage where memory hardens into myth and myth begins to judge. Chapter 3. As time moves forward in these traditions, something subtle but important begins to change. The figures who were once described as instructors slowly become framed as problems. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifts. Guidance becomes interference. Teaching becomes transgression. Memory becomes danger. I think this is one of the most honest moments in ancient storytelling, even if it is uncomfortable. It reflects a truth about human societies that repeats again and again. When a system works, its origins are respected. When it begins to strain, those origins are questioned. And when things finally break, the past itself is often blamed. Later Mesopotamian texts still remember the Apkallu, but they no longer sit comfortably in the background. Some are said to have withdrawn, others are described as having crossed lines. The language becomes careful. These beings are no longer simply sages, they are powerful, and power once separated from context becomes threatening. What strikes me is that the texts do not accuse them of malice, they accuse them of excess. This distinction matters. Excess implies imbalance, not evil. It suggests that something good was taken too far, or applied without restraint. And restraint, again, is one of the quiet moral anchors of these stories. As societies grew more complex, knowledge itself became stratified. Not everyone needed to know everything. Some knowledge was practical, some was sacred, some was restricted. This is not unusual, every civilization does this. But the Sumerians were unusually explicit about it. They spoke of knowledge that was appropriate for cities and knowledge that belonged only to the gods. The boundary between the two was not fixed. It shifted depending on circumstance, and when it was crossed too often, consequences followed. In later retellings, this crossing becomes the central drama. The Watchers, as they are later called, are no longer just observing. They are involved, too involved. They teach things that destabilize rather than stabilize. Metallurgy becomes weaponry. Astronomy becomes divination without wisdom. Calculation becomes control. This is where modern readers often get distracted. We jump immediately to questions of aliens, advanced technology, or lost civilizations. Those questions are interesting, but they risk missing the emotional core of the text. The fear expressed here is not technological. It is ethical. The concern is not that humans learn too much. It is that humans learned without understanding responsibility, without humility, without limits. In my opinion, that is a far more sophisticated anxiety than it's often given credit for. These stories are not celebrating a golden age lost to catastrophe. They are wrestling with the cost of progress without wisdom, and they are doing so through mythic language because myth is how ancient cultures explored complexity without pretending to resolve it. When we reach the flood narratives, this tension reaches its breaking point. But even here, the tone remains restrained. The flood is not described with rage, it is described with sorrow, with inevitability. As though the writers are acknowledging that once certain thresholds are crossed, reversal becomes impossible. What is fascinating is what survives. Not weapons, not monuments, not empires. What survives is knowledge, but only fragments of it. Enough to rebuild, but not enough to dominate. That choice feels intentional. Some texts suggest that certain beings were barred from returning. Others imply that their role changed. Oversight replaced instruction. Distance replaced intimacy. Watching replaced teaching. If you read this slowly, without modern assumptions, it feels less like exile and more like resignation. A recognition that humanity had reached a stage where direct guidance was no longer appropriate. And this is where I think many interpretations go wrong. They assume these stories are about punishment. I think they are about transition. When a child grows up, guidance changes. Rules are not removed, but enforcement shifts inward. Responsibility transfers. These myths may be describing something similar on a civilizational scale. After the flood, humans rebuild, cities return, writing resumes, law codes appear, but the tone is different. Authority is human now. Kings rule, gods advise from a distance, the Watchers fade into memory, yet memory itself becomes fragile. Texts begin to emphasize obedience rather than understanding. Ritual replaces explanation. Forms remain, but reasons blur. And once that happens, knowledge becomes dangerous again, because it can be used without wisdom. This may be why later traditions become more explicit about boundaries, why certain knowledge is labelled forbidden, why Watchers become fallen rather than withdrawn. It is easier to warn people away from danger than to teach them discernment. And so the stories harden. What began as careful reflection becomes moral instruction. Nuance gives way to cautionary tale. Complexity simplifies into right and wrong. This is not deception, it is adaptation. Every culture reshapes its inherited stories to meet its present needs. A society under pressure does not want ambiguity. It wants clarity. It wants rules. It wants lines that cannot be crossed. But something is lost in that process. The early Sumerian texts feel exploratory. They ask questions. They preserve uncertainty. They do not pretend to have final answers. Later traditions are more confident. They know who is right. They know who is wrong. They know what must never happen again. That confidence is understandable. But it should make us cautious as readers. Because when stories become too certain, they often stop listening to the past and start using it. One thing I find deeply human is that even as these traditions warn against excess knowledge, they preserve knowledge about excess knowledge. They remember what was taught. They record what went wrong. They refuse to erase the past entirely. This suggests that the goal was never ignorance, it was balance, and balance is fragile. As we move further away from the origins of these stories, interpretations multiply. Hebrew traditions absorb and reinterpret them. Other cultures echo them in different forms. The Watchers appear again, but now they are judged through new moral frameworks. Yet if you strip those layers away, the original concern remains surprisingly consistent. How does a society preserve wisdom without turning it into power? How does it teach without controlling? How does it remember without repeating its mistakes? These are not ancient questions. They're ongoing ones. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to unsettle us. Not because they describe something impossible, but because they describe something familiar. A moment when guidance ends, responsibility begins, and humanity is left alone with the consequences of what it has learned. That to me feels less like a myth about gods and more like a mirror. And it leaves us in a quiet place, not with answers, but with awareness. With the sense that history is not just something that happened to us, but something we are still participating in, whether we realize it or not. Chapter 4. As these stories continue to travel through time, they begin to do it with sehr menschliches. They simplify, not because the past was simple, but because memory under pressure always does. Complexity is heavy to carry across generations, so cultures compress it. They turn processes into characters, transitions into events, and long periods of uncertainty into single moments of decision. This is where the Watchers become unmistakably moral figures. In later traditions, especially those shaped outside of Mesopotamia, the ambiguity fades. The Watchers are no longer remembered primarily as instructors who withdrew. They are remembered as beings who crossed a line. They taught things that humans were not ready to carry, and because of that, the world suffered. What interests me here is not whether these accounts are literally true, but why they are framed this way. Because by this point in history, societies are no longer asking how civilization began, they are asking why it keeps breaking. Empires rise and fall, cities grow and collapse, knowledge accumulates and then disappears. Each cycle leaves people wondering whether something essential was lost along the way, or whether something dangerous was gained too quickly. The Watchers become a way of thinking about that tension. In the Book of Enoch, for example, the language becomes explicit. The Watchers descend. They teach metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology, and these teachings lead to violence, vanity, and imbalance. The world fills with bloodshed. The earth itself cries out. It is tempting to read this as anti-knowledge. But I don't think that's accurate. The problem is not that humans learn. It is that learning is disconnected from responsibility. Knowledge becomes a tool for domination rather than stewardship. Power accelerates faster than wisdom. That fear is timeless. What changes here is that restraint is no longer assumed. It must be enforced. In the earlier Sumerian material, limits feel implicit. The teachers set them. Humans accept them. Withdrawal happens quietly when the time is right. In these later traditions, limits are imposed after the fact. Punishment replaces guidance. Banishment replaces distance. This tells us something about the societies telling these stories. They no longer trust humanity to regulate itself, and honestly, that's understandable. Once states emerge, once warfare becomes organized, once resources are extracted at scale, the consequences of imbalance become visible. People see how quickly knowledge can be weaponized, how tools meant to build can destroy. So the story adapts. The Watchers become cautionary figures, not because they were evil, but because they represent a moment when too much happened too fast. What I find especially revealing is the way these traditions treat forbidden knowledge. It is never random. It is always specific. working with metals, manipulating natural forces, altering appearance, reading signs in the heavens. These are not abstract fears. They are anxieties rooted in real social change. Metallurgy changes warfare. Astronomy changes authority. Writing changes memory. Calculation changes power. Each of these technologies reorganizes society, and each requires ethical frameworks to prevent abuse. When those frameworks lag behind capability, fear follows. So the Watchers become symbols of acceleration without grounding, and then comes the Flood. Not as a sudden act of rage, but as a narrative reset, a way of saying something reached a point of no return. What survives the Flood is always carefully chosen. Not everything is worth saving. That is a brutal idea, but an honest one. In these stories, it is not the strongest who survive. It is the most attentive, the ones who listen, the ones who accept limits. That alone tells us how ancient cultures understood wisdom. Wisdom was not cleverness, it was restraint. After the Flood, the world is quieter, smaller, more cautious. Lifespans shorten, knowledge fragments, direct contact fades. From a modern perspective, this can look like decline, but from within the story, it looks like containment. The dangerous intensity of the earlier age is gone. Humanity is left to grow slowly, painfully, imperfectly, and the Watchers are no longer needed. What remains instead is law. Law replaces instruction. Codes replace memory. Ritual replaces relationship. This is not framed as progress or failure. It is framed as necessity. Humans need structure when wisdom cannot be guaranteed. I think this is where these stories become deeply uncomfortable, because they do not flatter us. They do not suggest that humanity naturally grows wiser with time. They suggest that wisdom must be constantly re-earned, and when it is not, knowledge becomes unstable. Later interpretations, especially modern ones, often romanticize the Watchers. They imagine a lost golden age, advanced beings, suppressed technologies. Understand the appeal. There is something comforting about the idea that answers were once known and then taken away. But the ancient texts themselves are more restrained. They do not mourn the loss of total knowledge, they accept it. In some passages, the loss even feels intentional, as if the writers understood that total access was unsustainable. That is a difficult thought to sit with, because it suggests that not all knowledge is meant to persist unchanged, that some things must be contextual, temporary, or limited to prevent harm. This is not censorship in the modern sense, it is stewardship, and stewardship always involves difficult choices. As these traditions pass into later cultures, the Watchers become angels, demons, rebels, messengers. Their roles fracture. Some watch over individuals, some guard boundaries, some fall, but the core tension remains. How close should the boundary between human and non-human knowledge be? How much guidance is too much? And when does help become interference? These are not questions with stable answers. They shift with circumstance. A small, vulnerable society may need more guidance. A powerful one may need distance. The stories seem to recognize this, which is why I hesitate when people try to extract absolute claims from them. These are not blueprints, they are reflections. They record how people thought about responsibility when facing forces they could not fully control. Whether those forces were natural, social, or symbolic almost doesn't matter. What matters is the emotional truth, a sense that civilization carries risks as well as benefits, a sense that progress without humility invites collapse, a sense that memory itself can be dangerous if it is not handled carefully. In my opinion, that is why these stories endured, not because they explain the world, but because they warn us gently, without shouting. They tell us that the line between guidance and domination is thin, that the difference between teaching and controlling can disappear without anyone noticing. That restraint is not weakness, but wisdom. And they leave us with a quiet responsibility, not to recover everything that was lost, not to resurrect every fragment of ancient knowledge, but to ask honestly what we are ready to carry. Because maybe the question was never what the Watchers knew. Maybe the question was whether humanity could learn without losing itself. And that question, uncomfortably, is still open. Chapter 5. By the time these stories reach their later form, something else has changed as well. The audience has changed. The people listening are no longer living close to the origins of cities. They are living inside complex societies, governed by laws, hierarchies, and institutions that feel permanent. For them, the past is not a memory. It is an explanation. And explanations are powerful. At this stage, the Watchers are no longer part of an open question. They are used to frame boundaries, to explain why the world is the way it is and why it cannot return to what it once was. What I notice here is how often the language shifts from description to justification. Lifespans are shorter because something went wrong. Direct contact ended because limits were broken. Knowledge is fragmented because it was misused. These are not accusations. They're attempts to make sense of loss. When societies experience decline or constraint, they almost always ask whether something essential was taken away. These stories answer that question in a way that preserves dignity. They say nothing was stolen, it was withheld. That is a subtle but important difference. To say something was stolen invites anger. To say it was withheld invites reflection. And reflection is exactly what these traditions encourage, even when they appear strict. Later texts emphasize obedience, but beneath that emphasis is something quieter, a recognition that not all beings, or all societies, mature at the same pace. That timing matters as much as intention. This is where I think the Watchers become symbols rather than characters. They represent the moment when capacity outpaced character, and that moment, once it happens, cannot be undone. You cannot unlearn a tool, you cannot erase awareness. You can only limit access, slow transmission, or change context. That is why later cultures focus so heavily on lineage, priesthood, initiation, and secrecy. Not because knowledge is evil, but because it is powerful. Power without preparation destabilizes. When you read these texts carefully, the fear is not that humans will become too intelligent. It is that they will become capable without being wise. That distinction matters. Modern readers often assume ancient cultures were afraid of progress. But these stories suggest the opposite. They were afraid of imbalance, of acceleration without grounding, of forgetting why something was taught in the first place. What I find almost painfully human is that these stories never fully resolve that fear. They don't conclude with harmony, they conclude with management. Humans are left to govern themselves, with rules, rituals, and memories of a time when guidance was closer. That memory becomes sacred. It is preserved, but kept at a distance. This distance creates longing, and longing in turn creates reinterpretation. Later generations begin to ask whether the Watchers were misunderstood, whether the punishment was too harsh, whether the loss was necessary, whether something valuable was taken prematurely. These questions appear quietly, often at the edges of tradition, in apocryphal texts, in mystical writings, in fragments that never become official. This tells us that doubt never disappeared, it was simply contained. And containment, again, is a form of stewardship. I think it's important to say this clearly. These traditions do not present a single, unified message. They present layers of thought across centuries. They record disagreement as much as consensus. Some voices emphasize caution, others emphasize loss, some mourn, others warn. That diversity is not a flaw, it is evidence of authenticity. Real traditions are not clean, they argue with themselves. What remains consistent, though, is the sense that knowledge changes relationships. Once humans learn to measure time, authority changes. Once they learn to shape metal, violence changes. Once they learn to record memory, responsibility changes. And once those changes occur, you cannot return to innocence. The Watchers, in this sense, may represent the last moment before innocence ended. Not innocence as ignorance, but innocence as trust. Trust that guidance will be used wisely. Trust that limits will be respected. Trust that power will not become dominance. When that trust erodes, distance follows, and distance reshapes myth. This may explain why later traditions turn Watchers into rebels or fallen beings, because it externalizes failure. It allows societies to say the problem came from outside, but the earliest layers do not say that. They suggest the problem emerged from within the relationship itself, from misunderstanding, from overreach, from forgetting why boundaries existed. That is a much harder truth to live with, because it implies responsibility does not disappear when guidance does, it increases. In my opinion, this is the quiet heart of these stories. They are not about gods abandoning humanity. They are about humanity being trusted with autonomy. And autonomy is frightening. It means mistakes cannot be blamed upward. It means consequences are real. It means restraint must come from within. As the Watchers fade from the centre of these traditions, humans step fully into history. Kings rise, laws harden, empires expand, and the old stories are told again and again, not to recreate the past, but to remind people what happens when balance is lost. These stories become ethical memory, not instructions, not prophecies, but reminders. Reminders that civilization is fragile, that power accelerates faster than wisdom, that knowledge must be carried carefully, and perhaps most importantly, reminders that the loss of guidance does not mean the loss of meaning. It means meaning must be cultivated. That is not a comfortable message, but it is a human one, and it leaves us with a quiet question, one that does not demand an answer, but invites reflection. If the Watchers stepped back because humanity was no longer ready for guidance, what does readiness look like now? Not technologically, not intellectually, but ethically. And are we any closer to it than those ancient scribes were when they first pressed their stylus into wet clay, trying to preserve not certainty, but caution? Chapter 6. As these traditions continue to echo forward, something interesting happens. The Watchers no longer sit clearly in the past. They begin to drift into the background of thought itself. They stop being figures you encounter directly and start becoming assumptions you live with, often without realizing it. By this point, the ancient world is no longer small. Trade routes stretch across continents. Writing systems multiply. Empires absorb older cultures and inherit their stories. And with each retelling, the original tone softens further. What was once reflective becomes symbolic. What was once cautious becomes moralized. Yet the underlying concern does not disappear. It simply changes language. Instead of watchers, texts speak of angels, messengers, spirits, intermediaries. Instead of forbidden knowledge, they speak of temptation, hubris, pride. The vocabulary shifts, but the anxiety remains familiar. There is still a fear of imbalance, still a concern about knowing too much, too quickly. Still a question about who should hold authority over knowledge. What changes is where responsibility is placed. In earlier texts, responsibility is shared. Teachers withdraw, humans stumble, the world resets. No single party is fully blamed. Later traditions increasingly locate responsibility within the human heart. Knowledge becomes dangerous because humans misuse it. The problem is no longer guidance, it is desire. This shift is subtle, but profound. It reflects societies that have accepted permanence. Cities are no longer experiments, they are institutions. Law is no longer provisional, it is absolute. And once systems feel permanent, failure becomes moral rather than structural. I think this is why the Watchers fade. They belong to a world where change was expected, where collapse was possible, where resets were imaginable. Later cultures, living inside empires, could not afford that openness. They needed stability, they needed clear rules, and so ambiguity became uncomfortable. But even as the Watchers recede, their shadow remains. You can see it in how later cultures talk about knowledge itself, about secrets, about initiation, about wisdom being earned rather than given. You can hear it in the way philosophers warn against arrogance, in the way religious texts caution against reaching too high, in the way myths repeat the idea that crossing certain thresholds comes with consequences. These are not primitive fears, they are reflections of experience. Human societies learn, again and again, that capability grows faster than judgment, that systems built for coordination can be used for control, that tools designed to understand nature can be turned against one another. The Watchers in this sense become unnecessary as characters because their lesson has been internalized. They no longer need to stand outside humanity, they live inside its stories. What I find especially meaningful is that even as traditions grow stricter, they never fully erase the earlier nuance. Fragments survive, contradictions persist, alternative interpretations remain tucked away in less official texts. This suggests that something in the human mind resists total closure. Even when rules are clear, questions remain. Even when stories claim certainty, doubt lingers. And maybe that is exactly what these ancient traditions were trying to preserve. Not answers, but awareness. Awareness that knowledge is never neutral. that teaching is never harmless, that power always reshapes relationships. When modern readers approach these texts, we often ask the wrong question. We ask whether the Watchers were real, whether they were gods, or aliens, or metaphors. Those questions can be interesting, but they are not the ones the texts themselves seem most concerned with. The texts are concerned with consequence. They ask what happens when instruction outpaces maturity, when systems grow faster than ethics, when memory becomes tool rather than guide, and they answer quietly that something always gives way. Sometimes it is trust, sometimes it is balance, sometimes it is closeness. What replaces it is structure. Structure is safer, it is predictable, but it is also colder. Law replaces guidance, ritual replaces relationship, doctrine replaces conversation. This is not presented as tragedy, it is presented as adaptation, and adaptation, while necessary, always carries loss. I think this is why these stories feel heavy rather than dramatic. They do not climax, they settle. They leave us in a world where the extraordinary has stepped back and the ordinary must carry on alone. That is not a punishment, it is adulthood. And adulthood, whether individual or collective, is rarely celebrated. It is marked by responsibility rather than wonder. As I read these traditions, I do not feel nostalgia for the Age of Watchers. I feel recognition. Recognition that every civilization reaches a point where it must decide how to carry what it has learned. Do we slow down? Do we limit access? Do we teach restraint alongside capability? Or do we assume wisdom will catch up on its own? The ancient texts suggest it does not. Wisdom must be cultivated deliberately, and when it is not, distance appears. Between teachers and students, between knowledge and meaning, between power and care. That distance is where myths are born. Not to explain the world, but to warn us about ourselves. In the end, the Watchers are less important than what replaces them. Humans inherit the responsibility they once held, and history becomes the long record of how well, or how poorly, that responsibility is carried. Sometimes we do well, sometimes we do not, and when we do not, we return to these stories. Not because they tell us what to believe, but because they remind us that we have been here before, that others have noticed the same patterns, that others have struggled with the same tensions, that the question of readiness never truly goes away. As this chapter closes, the Watchers are almost gone. They exist now as echoes, as warnings embedded in language, as reminders that knowledge is not the same as wisdom, and that progress is not the same as growth. What remains is humanity, alone with its tools, its memory, and its choices. Chapter 7. At this point in the story, it becomes important to slow down again, not because there is nothing left to explore, but because the deeper layers only appear when the pace eases. The Watchers may seem distant now, but their influence continues in quieter, less obvious ways, not as figures in the sky, but as ideas embedded in how ancient people understood responsibility, memory, and restraint. One thing that stands out when reading these traditions carefully is how rarely they speak in absolutes. Even when later texts sound confident or moralizing, there is often uncertainty beneath the surface. Phrases that suggest hesitation, passages that contradict one another, silences where clarity might be expected. This is not carelessness, it feels deliberate. Ancient writers understood something that modern readers sometimes forget. That uncertainty can be more honest than certainty, that leaving space for interpretation allows a story to remain alive across generations. The Watchers exist inside that space. They are never fully explained. Their nature shifts depending on context. Sometimes they are teachers, sometimes guardians, sometimes transgressors, sometimes witnesses, and sometimes they are barely described at all, mentioned only in passing, as if the audience already knows who they are. This ambiguity matters, because it mirrors the ambiguity of knowledge itself. Knowledge is never static. What is helpful in one era can be destructive in another. What saves a community at one moment can destabilize it later. The ancient texts seem deeply aware of this instability. That awareness is why limits appear again and again. Not limits on curiosity, but limits on transmission. Who is taught, when they are taught, and under what conditions. In early societies, knowledge was inseparable from survival. Farming techniques, water management, seasonal cycles, and craftsmanship were matters of life and death. Teaching the wrong thing at the wrong time could collapse an entire community. So instruction was careful, often ritualized, sometimes restricted. When the Watchers appear as teachers, they are never portrayed as indiscriminate. They choose, they sequence, they guide gradually, and when that process fails, they withdraw. That withdrawal is one of the most misunderstood elements of these traditions. It is often read as punishment, but it can also be read as containment. When something proves unstable, the response is not escalation, it is distance. Distance creates friction. Friction slows movement, and slowing movement can prevent collapse. Seen this way, the disappearance of the Watchers is not a dramatic rupture. It is a quiet adjustment. Human societies continue. Knowledge does not vanish, but the pace changes, the flow becomes uneven, progress stutters, memory fragments. From a modern perspective, this looks like regression. But the texts themselves do not frame it that way. They frame it as survivable. A slower world is a safer world. That idea may feel uncomfortable to us, especially now. We live in an age that equates speed with success and accumulation with progress. Ancient writers did not share that assumption. For them, endurance mattered more than expansion. This is why the Watchers are never fully blamed for what follows. Even in texts where they are portrayed as having crossed boundaries, responsibility is distributed. Humans choose, systems respond, consequences unfold. No single actor controls the outcome. That shared responsibility is one of the most human elements of these stories. It suggests that ancient cultures did not believe history was guided by simple cause and effect. They understood feedback loops, unintended consequences, cascading failures. When knowledge enters a system, it changes the system, and once the system changes, the same knowledge behaves differently. This is subtle thinking, and it does not feel accidental. The Watchers, in this sense, may represent early attempts to think systemically, to recognize that teaching is not neutral, that information reshapes social structures, that power redistributes itself in unpredictable ways. Once cities grow large enough, once hierarchies form, once writing fixes authority, the conditions that allowed for direct guidance no longer exist. You cannot teach 1 million people the way you teach a village. So the Watchers fade not because they are rejected, but because scale changes everything. This also explains why later traditions replace them with institutions, priesthoods, legal codes, canonical texts. These are attempts to stabilize knowledge at scale. But institutions come with their own risks. They preserve, but they also freeze. They transmit, but they also exclude. They stabilize, but they also resist change. The ancient texts seem aware of this trade-off. That is why unofficial traditions continue alongside official ones. Mystical interpretations, oral teachings, local variations. The Watchers survive most, clearly in these margins, not as rulers but as reminders that something once existed outside the system, something more fluid, more responsive, more personal. That memory never fully disappears. Even when direct contact is gone, people continue to imagine intermediaries, messengers, angels, spirits, guides. The form changes, but the need remains. Humans seem uncomfortable being entirely alone with their knowledge, and maybe that discomfort is justified, because autonomy without reflection can become arrogance, and arrogance, as these traditions repeatedly suggest, precedes collapse. What I find especially striking is that none of these texts suggest a return to the old world. There is no call to restore the Age of Watchers, no ritual to summon them back. Instead, there is adaptation. Humanity learns to live without proximity, to manage knowledge internally, to build ethical frameworks that do not rely on external supervision. That process is uneven, it fails often, but it continues. In that sense, the Watchers are less a lost presence than a developmental phase, a stage that could not last indefinitely, just as childhood cannot last forever, even when it is safe and guided. Eventually, responsibility must transfer, and transfer is always painful. This perspective reframes the entire narrative. The Watchers are not taken away. Humanity outgrows the conditions that made them necessary. Outgrowing does not mean surpassing, it means changing, and change always leaves traces of what came before. Those traces appear as myths, warnings, and quiet hesitations embedded in later cultures. They surface whenever societies sense that they are moving too fast or forgetting why boundaries exist. In those moments, ancient stories feel suddenly relevant again. not because they predict collapse, but because they recognize patterns of overreach, patterns of imbalance, patterns of forgetting restraint. The Watchers, then, are not figures of the past. They are mirrors. They reflect moments when guidance was possible and moments when it had to step back. And that reflection continues to matter, especially as civilizations grow more complex, more interconnected, and more powerful. By the end of this chapter, nothing is resolved. Nor should it be. The story is still unfolding. The Watchers may be distant, but the questions they raise remain close. About knowledge, about responsibility, about whether humanity can regulate itself without external correction. Those questions will not be answered quickly. Chapter 8. When the Watchers no longer appear as active figures, something else quietly moves into their place. Not new beings, not new teachers, but objects. Clay tablets, stone inscriptions, scrolls, archives. The physical preservation of knowledge becomes increasingly important once living guidance fades. This shift is subtle, but decisive. In early societies, knowledge lives in people, in memory, in practice, in repeated action. When guidance is personal, information moves through relationship. When guidance disappears, knowledge must be stabilized. That is where writing becomes more than record. It becomes substitute. The ancient Near East seems acutely aware of this transition. Texts do not celebrate writing as pure progress. They treat it with caution. Writing preserves, but it also freezes. It fixes ideas that were once flexible. It creates authority where once there was dialogue. This may explain why so many early texts emphasize correct transmission rather than innovation. The concern is no longer discovery, it is fidelity. Once knowledge is separated from its original context, it becomes fragile in a new way. It can be misunderstood, misapplied, detached from the conditions that once made it safe. The Watchers, when they taught, could adapt in real time. They could respond to misunderstanding. They could withdraw when limits were reached. Written knowledge cannot do that. It speaks once and then repeats forever. This creates a new kind of risk, not the risk of knowing too much, but the risk of knowing without understanding. Ancient cultures seem deeply aware of this danger. That awareness shows up in how archives are treated. Libraries are not simply storehouses, they are sacred spaces, restricted spaces, often tied to priesthoods or initiated groups. Access matters. Not because people should be kept ignorant, but because context matters. The idea that some knowledge requires preparation is not elitism in these texts, it is responsibility. When later traditions speak of lost tablets, burned libraries, sealed chambers, they are not only mourning destruction, they are grappling with the fear that knowledge, once unmoored from guidance, becomes unstable. This reframes the idea of loss. Not all loss is accidental, some loss is selective, that is uncomfortable to consider. But the texts hint at it repeatedly. Certain things are hidden, certain records are sealed, certain teachings are reserved. This does not appear as secrecy for its own sake. It appears as an attempt to control pace. If guidance cannot return, then timing must be managed another way. In this sense, the disappearance of the Watchers leads directly to the rise of tradition. Repetition becomes a safeguard, ritual becomes a stabilizer, canon becomes a boundary. But canon also creates tension, because once something is fixed, it resists change, and societies do change. That tension plays out again and again in ancient history. New conditions arise, old texts are reinterpreted, sometimes violently, sometimes quietly. What was once caution becomes command, what was once guidance becomes law, and law, unlike guidance, does not adapt easily. This may be why later cultures experience cycles of reform. Prophets, sages, philosophers emerge not to introduce new knowledge, but to reinterpret old knowledge. They act as translators across time. In a way, they take on a fragment of the Watcher's role, not by teaching new techniques, but by restoring proportion, by reminding societies why certain limits existed in the first place. This pattern appears across cultures, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Israel, in Greece. Different languages, similar concerns. Whenever systems grow rigid, voices arise to soften them. Whenever knowledge becomes tool of control, voices arise to question intent. These voices rarely succeed permanently, but they leave traces, and those traces accumulate. The Watchers are no longer needed as figures because their function has been distributed. It is carried by scribes, elders, teachers, reformers, imperfectly, unevenly, but persistently. What remains constant is the anxiety around preservation. How much should be kept? How much should be shared? How much should be forgotten? Forgetting is rarely discussed openly, but it is present everywhere, in omissions, in gaps, in contradictions between sources. The ancient world does not treat forgetting as failure alone. Sometimes it is relief, sometimes protection. To remember everything is to carry everything. And not all societies can survive that weight. This perspective changes how we view destroyed libraries and lost texts. Not every disappearance is the same. Some are violent ruptures, others are quiet abandonments. A tablet left uncopied is still a decision, and decisions shape memory as much as catastrophe. The Watchers, as symbols, hover over this process. They remind cultures that knowledge once flowed freely under supervision. Without that supervision, flow must be regulated. That regulation is never perfect. Mistakes happen, knowledge fragments, meaning shifts. But the effort continues. What strikes me most is how rarely these texts express confidence that the system will hold forever. There is no illusion of permanence, only maintenance. Civilization is treated as something that must be constantly adjusted. Not preserved unchanged, but kept within tolerable limits. This is where modern readers often misinterpret ancient caution as pessimism. It is not pessimistic. It is realistic. The ancient world had seen collapse. It had seen how quickly complexity can unravel. It had seen how knowledge can amplify both creation and destruction. So it moved carefully. And when it failed, it remembered why. The Watchers do not return in these later phases, but their absence continues to structure thought. Like scaffolding removed after construction, their imprint remains in the shape of what was built. By the end of this chapter, we are very far from Eridu and Uruk. The world is larger, louder, more crowded. Knowledge circulates faster, but meaning becomes harder to hold. The ancient tension has not disappeared. It has multiplied, and the question is no longer whether guidance should exist, but how responsibility can survive without it. That question is still unfolding. Chapter 9. When all of these traditions are placed side by side, something becomes clearer. Even if no final answer emerges, the stories about the Watchers were never meant to resolve tension. They were meant to hold it, to keep it present without forcing it into certainty. And that may be why they survive in fragments rather than as a single coherent account. What reaches us today is not a complete narrative, but a layered memory, one that passed through many hands, many cultures, and many moments of crisis. Each generation touched the story differently, shaped by its own fears and responsibilities. And yet, beneath those changes, a consistent concern remains visible. The concern is not about origin. It is not even primarily about power. It is about proportion. Ancient writers were trying to understand how much knowledge a society could carry without losing balance. They were observing how teaching alters relationships, how authority forms around information, and how quickly guidance can turn into control. These observations were not abstract. They were grounded in lived experience, in cities that grew too fast, in systems that became rigid, in collapses that arrived quietly rather than suddenly. The Watchers appear at the edge of those experiences. They stand at the point where instruction meets consequence, not as saviours and not as villains, but as markers of transition. Their presence signals a time when knowledge was close, direct, and personal. Their withdrawal signals a shift toward distant structure and mediation. What matters is not whether they existed as beings. What matters is why societies needed to imagine them. They needed a way to think about the moment when guidance no longer scaled, when wisdom could not move as fast as technique, when human systems grew more complex than the relationships that once held them together. In that sense, the Watchers are less about the past than about thresholds. Moments when something changes, irreversibly, and the only option left is adaptation. The ancient texts do not suggest that this adaptation is smooth. They describe confusion, fragmentation, and loss. Knowledge does not disappear, but it becomes unevenly distributed. Authority becomes more centralized. Memory becomes selective, and interpretation becomes contested. This is where later readers often introduce modern assumptions. They imagine suppression, conspiracy, deliberate erasure. While some destruction was certainly violent and intentional, the texts themselves suggest something quieter and more complicated. Much was lost simply because it could no longer be carried in the same way. Once guidance becomes abstract, knowledge must be simplified. Once societies expand, memory must be compressed. Once authority formalizes, nuance gives way to rule. None of this requires malicious intent. It emerges from scale. And scale is one of the most underestimated forces in history. Small communities can rely on shared understanding. Large ones cannot. They require standardization. And standardization always trades depth for reach. The Watchers belong to a world before that trade-off became unavoidable. As their stories pass into later traditions, they are reshaped to fit new realities. They become moral examples, warnings, sometimes transgressors, sometimes fallen figures. This transformation does not mean the original idea was forgotten. It means it was translated into a form that could survive within more rigid systems. What is striking is that even in their most moralized versions, these stories retain traces of hesitation. They do not fully condemn curiosity. They do not fully praise obedience. They circle the problem rather than naming it directly. That circling is important. It reflects an understanding that the relationship between knowledge and responsibility cannot be solved once and for all. It must be revisited, repeatedly, under changing conditions. This is why the Watchers never return, in the stories. Not because return is impossible, but because return would imply regression. The ancient writers seem to understand that once a threshold is crossed, the world cannot be restored to an earlier state. It can only move forward differently. That forward movement is uncertain. It involves error, it involves imbalance, it involves learning through consequence rather than instruction. In other words, it involves adulthood. What these traditions quietly record is a coming of age on a civilizational scale, a movement from guided development to self-regulation, and like all such movements, it is incomplete and uneven. Some societies adapt better than others, some preserve restraint longer, some accelerate too quickly and fracture. The texts do not hide this variability, they accept it. What they resist is the idea that more knowledge automatically leads to better outcomes. Instead, they suggest that knowledge intensifies whatever structures already exist. If those structures are balanced, knowledge deepens them. If they are unstable, knowledge accelerates collapse. This observation remains uncomfortable because it offers no reassurance. It does not promise that wisdom will naturally follow innovation. It implies that wisdom requires effort, intention, and often delay. The Watchers, when seen through this lens, represent a time when delay was still externally enforced, when boundaries were maintained through relationship rather than law, when teaching could pause if imbalance appeared. Once that external regulation fades, restraint must come from within human systems, from culture, from ethics, from memory. That is a fragile arrangement, and the ancient writers knew it. They did not respond with despair, but they also did not respond with confidence. They responded by preserving stories that refuse to simplify the problem, stories that hold contradiction without resolving it, stories that remember both the benefits and the dangers of guidance, stories that acknowledge loss without glorifying it. When modern audiences approach these texts, it is tempting to ask what we should believe about them. But belief is not the category they operate in. They function as reminders rather than doctrines. They do not tell us what to do with this knowledge. They leave that to us. And perhaps that is the most human element of all. The ancient scribes did not imagine themselves as final authorities. They wrote knowing their words would be read out of context, misunderstood, and reinterpreted. Yet they wrote anyway. Carefully, slowly, with restraint. They preserved uncertainty on purpose. That uncertainty is not weakness. It is respect for complexity. As this final chapter settles, there is no revelation waiting at the end, no hidden key, no instruction revealed at the last moment. What remains is a long record of people trying to live with the consequences of knowing. The Watchers are part of that record, not as answers, but as markers, signs that earlier societies noticed the same tensions we continue to navigate. These questions do not belong to the ancient world. They belong to every world that builds faster than it reflects. And that may be why these stories still feel heavy, not dramatic, but weighty. They ask us to sit with responsibility rather than escape into certainty. They do not demand agreement. They invite attention. and attention, sustained over time, may be the closest thing to wisdom these traditions ever promised.